Welcome everyone. Yeah, there are still people coming in, but we will just deal with that as we go along. Um, Welcome everyone to our Buber seminar at the Ernst Bloch Center for German Thought of the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the School of Advanced Study. So we're doing this online, which is new for many of us, certainly for me, and I'm co-convening this seminar with Vic Seidler, who is, you can see him in the screen. I think everybody should start, if you want to, you can just start your video as long as you keep yourself muted until you're speaking. Then I hope that we get a good connection. If there are problems later on, then we'll just deal with that as we go on. Yeah, so I see a number of people that are familiar. I see a number of new people that I don't know, and so I'm looking forward very much to getting to know all of you as we go on this journey. I am sort of the director of the Bloch Center at School of Advanced Study, and I'm working on the philosophy of Bloch, but also a lot on philosophies of communication. And it's in that context that we have decided to spend this year. We have this seminar every year. This is the first time we're doing it online. To spend this seminar thinking together about what Buber has to say to us today, and that will be sort of the theme that we will gather around. The seminar is yeah, but I'm going to have to find my way in how to deal with the Zoom situation. So I think we will hopefully find out as we go on how to do that. There are a few things that sort of housekeeping things that I think I should probably say in advance, and then we can start to introduce each other to the group, so we know who we are and what our interests are. The seminar is co-convened between me and Vic, and maybe it's a good idea for us to sort of say a bit about how this came to be and our thoughts around it, and then to maybe think a little bit about how we can work together as a group, what that would mean. And how we can make this into a learning community or a learning environment rather than a seminar type situation. Vic, do you want to say hello to the group?
Yeah, hello everybody, and it's wonderful to see some people who, like Danny, who I recognize. This is really an experiment, and we're really on a journey into new territory. And Johan and myself, when we imagined the idea of doing a Buber seminar, we originally thought we would be sitting in Senate House in a room with 8 people around the table. That was the kind of that was the imagination from the beginning.
Yeah.
But the world has changed so quickly since March that we find ourselves in a very different kind of room. And it's important to think about what kind of space this is in which we're trying to talk to each other, particularly given that this is a workshop on Buber, where it's really important to both listen to each other. And it's a real question as to how we can learn to listen to each other on Zoom. We've got so many more people because now we, rather than just being in a small room on Senate House, we're now in a global space, and people are joining us with very different intellectual, moral, religious, and spiritual histories from very different parts of the world. So suddenly the room has become a kind of global space, which is just enormously creates enormous new possibilities for how to think and how to dialogue across very different cultures, but also across very different intellectual, religious, and spiritual traditions. So I think both Johan and myself, in talking about this, have wanted to welcome this as a kind of new opportunity, but also to think that we want to develop a different or new kinds of relationships of teaching and learning within this space. And we thought originally, there's a kind of wonderful book by the African-American philosopher and social critic that talks about the importance of creating a kind of trust space. How do we create a space in which we can trust each other enough to speak in a way that does justice to what Buber is trying to frame in his writing and in his thinking? And that's what we wanted to try and do, but wanted to do it very much together with everybody, not thinking that Johan and myself either know more than anybody else about Buber, or that we're setting ourselves up as kind of teachers in a kind of traditional kind of way, and that we're trying to create a different or new kind of space in the way that Bell Hooks, that was the name, it kind of disappeared from me for a moment itself. Bell Hooks was the person who wrote the book called Teaching to Transgress. And it's a wonderful text. We might send kind of some pages around for everybody, but she talks about the difficulty of creating a kind of teaching and learning environment in which you can really begin to work with and learn with other people. So at any stage, what we want is as much feedback as we can get as we go round, and as many kind of suggestions about how this journey that we're all going to be on together can work well. Now, it might be that this isn't what people expected. And Johan and myself had talked about the first couple of weeks or the first 2 sessions should be sessions in which people can think about, is this for me? Is this going to be right? Is this going to help my reading and my thinking and my learning? And if it isn't, then people are free, obviously, to leave and just to say goodbye. But for those who want to stay, that there should be some kind of real commitment, both to the reading and the thinking and the voicing of our own experience in the space that we create together.
Yeah.
I think that's just a beginning. There are then ways that we were thinking that what we would do would be to go round and each one of us say something about what relationship we might have had to Buber in our kind of backgrounds. Say something just a little about how we've coped in this new world of COVID.
Yeah.
What does it mean to think about distance and relation? So the theme of distance and relation, which will be a text that we focus on in 2 weeks' time, but just to think about what distance means and what relation means in this very new world of COVID. And that we would then go round with people sharing on those themes.
Yeah.
That would be kind of way of beginning.
Thanks, Vic. I think that would be very, very good, and I hope that you're all in agreement with that. Maybe a couple of things that I should add also in terms of the organization of it. There is a chat. For those who are not so familiar with Zoom, there is a chat function on the side, And somebody has already put there a link to a PDF of Teaching to Transgress. So thank you very much, Marcus, for doing that.
That's wonderful. That shows the new world we live in.
That goes very, very fast. That's excellent. So people can look at that. We'll tell you which pages we had in mind about creating a learning community that you might want to have a look at. We are recording the sessions. And so the idea would be that we meet every 2 weeks, and then maybe in the week in which we don't meet, you could listen to the recording if you wanted to reflect on what we said and sort of hopefully create a kind of continuing conversation throughout the course of the series. And they will be made available on the module webpage where you also registered. So I will put those links there to the recording after the sessions. And then you can listen to those in sort of the fallow weeks, as it were. On that website, there are also going to be links to the literature. So we will have short texts by Buber that we will read together and discuss. But they're going to be relatively short, and within them we will also focus on relatively short passages so that we can discuss them in depth, as it were, taking a kind of fractal approach. If you zoom in closely enough on any element of a thinker's body of work, then you get everything back, as it were. But at the same time, there will also be a lot of other literature that maybe we find or that you want to share with the group, or that we come across, and we will share at least titles or references and maybe sometimes PDFs with people, so that you can also explore Buber a little bit more in that direction. But that's something that I think would very much something to be a group effort. And so I want to ask you if you are happy for your email address to be shared with others in the group, to just send me an email with your address, and then I will make an email list so that we can easily communicate with each other offline and send each other information and emails and things that we want to do. If you want to share in the group but you don't want to share your email address, then let me know, and then I will put you in the blind CC box, and then you will get at least everything that goes around, but you won't then be able to send anything yourself. Okay, Maya says that she has to leave and enter again. Go ahead and do that. I hope that you will come back. Yeah, there may be problems with people entering every now and then. We'll just have to take that as it comes. And so please do that. And with respect to the recordings, the policy of the School of Advanced Study is that we record seminars like this. But if you don't want to be identifiable, then when you want to say something and you don't want your voice to be in the recording, then please just use the chat function, because I believe that the chat is not going to be visible. It will just be the recording of what is said. So that's just a little bit in advance. Vic and I met at Leo Baeck College, which is here in London, and Vic, of course, taught at Goldsmiths social theory for many years. But we met at Leo Baeck College on a session on teaching and learning, which I was facilitating, and that's where we found out we have a lot of common interests, and our sort of conversation, which has been going on for over a year now, started around a short text by Carl Rogers, and that's a few. I'll send that around afterwards, which was a text about notes on becoming a teacher, or on being a teacher, in which Carl Rogers says that he's lost interest in teaching, and he no longer wants to be a teacher. And he says that is because everything that is not self-appropriated learning with the aim of changing your behavior is something that in the end becomes unfruitful as a teaching practice. And it was around that text by Rogers, which has quite a far-reaching impact on the practice of teaching in higher education, that we started our discussion. And then we moved into talking about Carl Rogers' dialogue with Martin Buber, which is also a text that I want to share with you, and that we will send around later on, which is a classic text in communication studies, as well as in philosophy and in psychotherapy. And that's really about the nature of human relations. And this is where this idea of Buber's, that the relation between an I and a you, the intersubjective relation, is totally unique and requires its own way of thinking through on its own terms, where that became a topic that we talked about. And out of this came a set of conversations around the nature of social relations and the nature of communication. And that's how we started to think about this topic, and why we're interested in it. So I think, yeah, we have to make a decision. We have 25 participants. What do you propose? Shall we split up the group for the introductions, or shall we just go around and not take too long, but for everyone to maybe say a little bit about what brings them to the seminar and your interest in Buber? I would be sort of tempted to try to keep the group together if that's possible. Does everybody agree with that? Or and if we can just go around like that, then we will have a sense of, one of the things, of course, it's somewhat, as Vic already said, it's almost ironical to start talking about Buber in this context, which is about as far removed from the I-thou relation as you can imagine. But maybe not. Maybe there are ways in which we can learn to think about it, and in a way that heightens the relevance of it. Because for me, as we will come to discuss, for me there is the germ of an insight in Buber, that he, almost like a sleepwalker, that he sort of half gets, that points to something very important about human communication, that we are at risk, and that we ignore at our own peril, as it were, and that we acknowledge to our own benefit. And that is something that today is coming up in a heightened sense in the way that media are functioning today, and especially under these conditions of COVID. And so we'll talk about that later on. But let's maybe go around first. So to just for everyone to just introduce themselves a little bit and say hello. So maybe if I could just follow the screen. Patricia, if I can start with you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so my name is Patricia Meinl. I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen. And I'm currently writing a dissertation on second personal relations. So I originally come from the tradition of phenomenology, but I think Buber was probably the first author I read after I started my PhD. And since then, it's been 2.5 years now, and since then, I always find myself coming back to some of his texts. So it just sparked an interest in me. So I'm very happy to read some of the texts that I've also been reading before together with you, and see how other people, maybe from different backgrounds, read those texts.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah. Are you in the Dan Zahavi's center? Or,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Andrea.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Velumpi. I am doing a PhD under the supervision of Dr. Siebers, a politically oriented PhD, trying to undermine the neoliberal utopia, which I would present as an anti-utopia. I will work mostly with blogs, philosophy, utopian anthropology and ontology. And my interest in Buber is, I find him to be very similar to Bloch in many respects. And I agree to a great extent with the political project that he was writing about in terms of creating an intersubjectivity which doesn't necessitate authority, unnecessary authority, a collectivity of that nature. And I want myself to explore that even more later on in my work.
Thank you, Andrea. Artemis.
Hello everyone, I'm Artemis. I'm a music historian mainly. So I'm always the odd one out in these seminars, but I will persist and I will keep coming. I'm not interested. I mean, I'm following the seminars because I'm interested in the ideas and philosophy. So I'm looking forward to that. But my main specialism is music, music history, and piano. If I have anything to contribute, I don't know, I'll sing a song. So I'm very much looking forward to learning in these sessions.
Great. Okay, I think singing is a big theme for Buber. Yeah. So yeah.
Good way of communicating.
Yeah. Daniel. Daniel Smith, can you
unmute?
I don't know if I can unmute you.
I think I'm on mute.
Yeah. We can hear you. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much for putting the course on. I'm very grateful for something stimulating in these times. I've now retired as a Reform rabbi in London. I first encountered Buber when I was very young. The Way of Man, Hasidic stories, and since then his Bible commentaries. So that's the side of Buber that I used for many decades, but I've kind of avoided the Zionist writings and the philosophical writings. So it may be a different approach to where I hope to end up, but I'm certainly interested to get a rounder picture of him. So thank you again, and looking forward to interact.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
I think that's great. I think there's a moment where I just want to say, as someone who's also retired, that sometimes we reflect back on what our earlier influences have been. And it's a really important creative space when we're no longer under the disciplines of work in the way that we traditionally are. And sometimes I felt this for me too, Dan, that earlier interests and earlier inspirations that might well have taken you into the rabbinate initially return in a different way as you have this kind of second chance or second life in which to reflect on what was really significant. Just for me to share just a second on this, because Buber was really important in forming me as I grew up. When I was a teenager, I used to read Buber, and Buber shaped my philosophical and kind of emotional responses, particularly some of the early Hasidic writings that were collected in a book called The Ladder or something. I can't quite remember the exact title. But then when I went to Oxford in the mid-60s as a philosophy student, all of a sudden Buber was not only marginalized, but not referred to, because there was this radical split, particularly in British analytical philosophy, between theology and philosophy. And Buber was regarded as a figure within Jewish philosophy and taught within theology departments. So suddenly the insights that Buber had, which I think are really important in the present moment, were excluded and marginalized. And I felt there was no way that I could speak Buber or even refer to Buber within the kind of philosophy taught when I was a kind of student. And he remained a certain kind of somewhat marginalized figure, even though he spoke really importantly. And in Britain, it was in 1947 that Buber's paper on distance and relation was first published in a kind of psychotherapy, Institute of Psychoanalysis context. Yeah. So when I spoke to Johan, when Johan and myself met, it was like a moment of real dialogue when we discovered that we could really talk philosophy with each other and together. And that doesn't happen very often in one's life. But Buber's asking us to reflect upon the possibilities of dialogue. And it might well be, and Johan and myself have talked about this, that some of the papers or the short pieces of Buber's writings, people might want to discuss with close friends, not both in this class, but also outside, and use the 2-week break that we have between the different classes to really reflect on how Buber is really kind of resonating with your experience and possibly bringing you back to insights that are important or were important, but need to be brought back at a different stage in your own life.
Thanks, Vic. Yeah, that's indeed a point that we discussed. That try to it's Buber's philosophy is philosophy of dialogue. So trying to have a dialogue here, but also to, when you're reading him, to have dialogues with others in your area and in your life can be an important part of getting to the meaning of these ideas. And we also hope that later on in the seminar you will be some of you at least will be willing to present some of their ideas and what the engagement with Buber has meant for them. We can talk about that later on. But let's continue with Marcus Holzheit now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for putting this on. It's very, very interesting. My background in Buber is basically I was introduced to him by my late father-in-law, who was a consultant psychiatrist and who taught Buber to divinity students, non-Jewish divinity students. However, my main interest in Buber is because I've been living in Israel for the last 40 years. And I was very, very interested in his work with Brit Shalom and the concept of dialogue with our Palestinian neighbors, which unfortunately is not what goes on in Israel today. However, I've been brought back to Buber because my background is IT, and I'm involved in something which is probably not very well known, which is called structured democratic dialogue, which is a process of systematic thinking whereby one can put together a group of people in a room with differing backgrounds, differing objectives, differing goals, and reach a consensus through a process of dialogue. Mm. And we're looking at how this could actually be done electronically, because obviously it takes away totally from the I-thou approach, but the fact that people can contribute over online to a dialogue rather than the current process of threats and tweets and whatever else one does over the internet would be a totally different paradigm for discussions of the kind which we're having at the moment.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really important idea, and I hope that you'll be able to tell us more about it. Creating dialogic situations in internet communication is, of course, one of the main challenges of today, and will be instrumental, I think, in changing the destruction of the public sphere that we are witnessing all over the world. And I think that is a very important notion, and I think that there's a lot to say with Buber about that. So that sounds very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very good to bring in not only the political elements, but to recognize that one of the difficulties in the seminar is that we're meeting each other for the first time, many of us online. And that's different from moving online with people that you already have relationships with.
Yeah.
The notion of a wider political dialogue where you're meeting people sometimes for the first time online is one of the things that we can mirror. That's one of the things that we're experimenting with in this course, the attempt to be able to dialogue, but also to get to know each other, where many of us are meeting each other for the first time online.
I think there are many of these, or several of these ways of making Buber's ideas fruitful for building communication practices. I'm doing quite a bit of work now on nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg's work, And that also is very clearly inspired by Buber, by the distance and the relation that are involved in communication. So thanks very much for that, Marcus. You're saying something, but you're muted.
One of the things that most upsets me, and all of the people I'm working with on the concept of structured democratic dialogue, no one has actually ever heard of or looked at the work of Buber.
Yeah, yeah.
So
well, we're going to do something
very
about
timely.
that. Yeah, cool. Okay, Carmen. We can't hear you yet. Yeah, no.
I'm talking from Chile. I'm a journalist and I
You
work
have to speak a bit louder.
I'm talking from Chile. I am a journalist and I'm working in communication, but in the field of screenwriting. I'm interested in fiction and the kind of relationship that is between between the poetical object and the author, and I found Paul Ricoeur very interesting. So I have deepened in Ricoeur, and I am interested in his hermeneutics and etc. And from there on, I came to Buber, but because I'm interested in the dialogical conversation that goes between the text and the reader, or the television, film, series, cinema, etc., and the spectator, the kind of relationship that is there regarding the representation of it. I thought that this would be a perfect environment to go far away, go further in this kind of reflection in a new author for me. I haven't read Buber yet, but I will.
Okay, thanks very much. Welcome to the group. Thank you.
Yeah,
Katrina, very, very nice to see you here.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Katrina Nihul. I'm in University College Cork in Ireland, in the German department. So I really want to read more Buber. So I have a slight acquaintance. Important topics for me in my work have been utopia and biography. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in a philosophy of dialogue is that I think, certainly in the fields I work in, there's been a lot of preoccupation with identity, subjectivity, selfhood, but I think they really need to be, it's like wanting to go beyond that into philosophy of dialogue. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, looking forward to your participation in the group. And the German context of Buber is, of course, something that will also interest us, where he comes from and what the influences are and how he responds to that. Anastasia, welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anastasia Christou. Thanks very much to Johan and Vic for creating and offering so generously this digital dialogic space. I'm really interested in this invigorating context of exchange and communication. I have faint nostalgic memories as an undergraduate student in my reading philosophy of bits and pieces of Buber, but haven't really explored in research and writing. However, the dialogic is central to everything that I'm involved in as a teacher, as a researcher, as an activist, as a feminist, as an anti-racist. The dialogic is very much the central core of everything that frames my own existential journey and my exchange and relations with others. So I'm very much interested in exploring it in this particular context through the digital and in a crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, very true. Yeah, thanks very much for reminding us of the whole spectrum of things that we are involved with here. Yeah. Jose, welcome to you as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Jose. Thank you, Vic and Johan, for organizing this meeting. My background is, everything is in philosophy. and I've been working since I finished my PhD 15 years ago on philosophy of technology, media theory, philosophy of communication, and I don't know anything about Martin Buber. They are keeping dust here in my shelves, but I think it's a good opportunity to take the books off and learn with you. So I'm not really an expert. I never read really read Buber, only I and Doe when I was in an undergraduate student, but I'm looking forward to learning from you.
Excellent, good. Yeah, so maybe we should mention that you your part of your intellectual pedigree is with the work of Friedrich Kittler,
Yes.
and that I don't think there is probably a bigger distance, intellectual distance imaginable than Kittler and Buber. So let's see what we can do with that. Yeah.
Like Isaiah Berling, I'm a fox said. No,
Yeah.
so I'm looking. I will try to. I'm not a hedgehog, but I will try to behave like a fox, and I try to learn.
Okay, good. We're looking forward to that. Definitely. Federico.
Hi everyone. I am Federico Flaury. I'm a PhD student based at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, in London. So based where this seminar is usually hosted in time, not in pandemic times. And my project is about Ernst Bloch and the idea of Zionism, and I'm supervised by Johan Siebers. And first of all, I'd like to thank Johan and Vic for organizing this seminar and for giving it this, for taking this approach to the discussion, and also to putting this effort in creating what I call, I'm already using this word, in creating the community of thinkers around Buber. I think this is one of, I felt this as one of the aims of this introduction. So I have to admit it's the first time that it happens to me to discuss from, let's say an academic point of view, a text with not just an intellectual commitment, but what I call a spiritual commitment. This is at least what I got from your introduction, Vic, and your introduction, Johan, about this. So thanks for this approach. My interest in Buber is related to my PhD research. Buber was a figure who played a pivotal role for a series of German Jewish thinkers at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I'm very much interested in how he, in a way, rediscovered some mystical traits of Judaism, which then were picked up by other thinkers. And so it was probably the one who prompted a process of revitalization of Judaism at the beginning of the 20th century. This is the way I'm interested in Buber, but I'm also quite eager to learn and discuss more about the relation between the inwardness of his thought, the dialogical aspect of his philosophy, and the political outcomes of the philosophy of communication. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Federico. And I should also mention that that we asked Federico to take a role as co-convener of the seminar in semester 2, when we're going to confront some of Buber's ideas with some other approaches to thinking about social relations and about intersubjectivity. And so we'll deal with that when we get to the second semester. The first semester will be focusing on Buber's texts themselves. So welcome, Federico, and thanks for joining us. Liam.
Hello, I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Dundee. My acquaintance with Buber is negligible, not to say minimal, but I'm very interested in a certain radical Jewish legacy of thinkers like Benjamin Bloch, obviously, Lukács, Adorno, and Buber just seemed a sort of glaring gap in my knowledge. So I thought, why not go for this?
That sounds excellent. Yeah, sounds like a good.
What are you working on, Liam? In terms of
currently, I'm doing some research on the dialectics of presentation and representation in Alain Badiou. So it's nothing to do with this. But yeah. So right now it's Alain Badiou, Hegel, and Deleuze.
Right.
So, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay.
An interesting conversation.
I'm in my reading of Buber, there's a radical departure from all dialectical ways of thinking, as much as from phenomenology and or any sort of Kantianism.
Mm-hmm.
But he comes out of all these things, and so I think that would be very interesting to explore.
Okay.
And one of the ways to do that is to look at representation and presentation. Yeah. Thanks and welcome, Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter Meilander. I'm in the United States. I teach at a small college called Houghton College. It's a very small Christian private liberal arts school in the western part of New York State. About 700 undergraduate students. I teach political science. We're so small, I suppose you could say I am political science. At a small place, you cover a lot of ground. My training is in political theory. My research is in politics and literature. So I have sort of broad humanities interests, and I work especially with German language literature, with special interest in Switzerland and Austria. And so I'm like several of the people, I'm sort of a novice to Buber. I've read I and Thou. And then last year I read the new Mendes Flohr biography and found myself sort of interested in thinking this might be somebody worth coming back to. And so since my interests kind of circle around this political, theological, literary nexus, and we've got somebody coming out of the Habsburg world, broadly speaking, saw the online announcement and thought, well, this is a seminar I actually couldn't attend if it weren't online, and I was kind of excited at the opportunity. So thank you very much.
That's true, and we've said that we have people that would otherwise never have attended the seminar, and that's in itself a very interesting thing to be working with. So welcome very much to our group. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I wanted to say something else, and now it has slipped my mind. It'll come back in a minute. I wanted to say something. Oh yes, I wanted to mention that Peter Mendes Flohr, who is the editor of the critical edition of blocks of Buber's writings, and published this wonderful intellectual biography of Buber last year, he will come in to give a guest talk in November on the dialogue and the phenomenology of trust. So we will have a chance to speak with him, I think, on the 16th of November. Right. So,
and also his book is a really helpful introduction to people who want to know something also not only about the philosophy, but the political and cultural background out of which Buber is emerging, and also linking to what Federico said. There's a way that Buber's early translations of the tales of Rabbi Rachman was a real influence across European culture at that time in Germany and Austria and in France. So there were ways that his influence, Buber's influence, even if it wasn't clearly recognized, was acknowledged across an intellectual field, both of philosophy, literature, and cultural studies and politics. So, and I think the Mendes Flohr biography does give you a sense of that breadth of connections, and I think that that could be a really useful way in, and to see how one of the difficulties of reading Buber is the way that he does think across intellectual and disciplinary boundaries.
Yeah, that's true. And he
also one of the ways he's really interesting as well in the present moment, when the kind of post-structuralist common sense is kind of breaking down, and people are looking for new ways of working both intellectually and politically, Buber's work and the question of dialogue, as already has come out, can really talk very directly into issues that we face in the present.
Thank you, Vic. And yeah, so Buber also was one of the early figures in the, let's say, the German Jewish emancipation movement from the late 19th century. And he started the adult education movement in Germany. He was much more than a philosopher. He was a cultural figure, and people came to him to talk about what they wanted to achieve. And I think in a way he stands for this moment of the fusion of the German intellectual tradition with Judaism in a very original way, which later on became, of course, so devastatingly problematic. And Leo Baeck, I remember, writes somewhere beautifully that the fruitful relation, or I think he even says the love affair, I'm not sure, between the German language and Judaism, writing after the war, is over forever for good. So he took distance from the German language. But in Buber, we see this is the first moment where Judaism and this German tradition of writing comes to a fusion and creates something new. Buber comes out of Neo-Kantianism, we will discuss that. His notion of this I-thou and I-it relation bears all the traits of a Kantian way of thinking, but he includes in it, or he looks at it from a particularist point of view right from the start. His own dissertation was about the principle of individuation in German thought with Nicholas of Cusa and Jacob Böhme. So you see already there this interest in this individualizing moment. And he takes that up in the context of German intellectual history. So there's a lot there that we can explore. So thanks, Peter. Erit.
Yes, thank you. It's lovely to be here with you. I am a rabbi serving just north of London. And when I was studying many years ago, then of course Buber was mentioned, and we read a couple of things, but very little. And I'm interested, and I wanted to know a bit more. And quite apart from anything else, one of my best friends when I was going to school was the granddaughter of Buber. So it was.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
A nice personal connection in the group.
Yeah.
Yeah. I once met the widow of Buber's daughter. Yeah. Who came to a talk that I gave in Tel Aviv, but I insulted him terribly. So thanks very much. That sounds good. Whitney.
Hi, everybody. I'm Whitney. I first heard Buber's name when I was taking an undergrad class on Heidegger. And unfortunately, it was just like something that like one of my classmates said, and I didn't get a chance to like really look deeper into it. And then fast forward a couple of years, I am now in a master's program for psychotherapy training. And we've been talking a lot about Carl Rogers, actually, and we were watching some of his videos where he taped himself when he was counseling clients. And during like one of them, he mentioned something about the I-thou relationship. And I knew that was a reference to Buber. So I thought it was a really good time to start looking into Buber and you know, like seeing what he has to say about these issues. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much and welcome.
That's great. I think the links between the philosophy and the psychotherapy are also links that are very alive within Buber's work. And therefore the moves to bring like the personal and the therapeutic into relationship with the political and the moral are there as open possibilities within Buber's work. So some of the reasons that he's been a marginal figure means that at the moment or in the present, what he has to offer is really significant and important, and people are beginning to recognize that. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like that the link between like philosophy and literature and also just psychology and the practice of therapy is an area that's enormously interesting, but kind of underappreciated at this moment. So it'll be good to address that here.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Okay, great, wonderful. Yeah, so yeah, various modes of dialogue and how they are related. Christina,
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Christina Viti. I'm also here as a bit of an outsider, I'm afraid. I work as a translator. My main languages are French and Italian, but in the course of my work as a translator, I've just become aware of a particular strand in critical thought, particularly in Italy, which has deep connections with German scholarship. So I'm here to sort of add what has previously been a missing link, and I'm very grateful for this chance.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, with the topic of translation, we're of course also with Benjamin, and the relation between Benjamin and Buber is, I think, also a fascinating one.
Yes.
Yeah, I can say a lot about that. Jordan.
I hope you do.
Yeah,
I hope you do.
I will. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jordan.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm currently in California, and my background is in conflict resolution and peacemaking. And my interest in Buber, I think as another friend was saying, democratic dialogue. So my interest is in democratic dialogue too, but within the context of peacemaking or transitions to peace. And I find Buber's thinking to really be interdisciplinary and to offer a lot of insight and motivation to really delve deeply into the challenge of what it means to genuinely work with the quote unquote other. And that's a tendency I think is really a reality that I think is really pronounced in such context, any human context. So that's just a bit about me. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jordan. I think that's a crucial point for me to emphasize right from the start. Is the dialogue is about a relation with the other, and not in any way about subsuming or appropriating the other into our own whatever it is that we want. So that's a very important topic, and it comes across in Distance and Relation. We'll look at that very soon. Thank you. Sylvia. You're muted still. Can you unmute yourself, or is that not working? You should be able to click that, yeah, that microphone.
It's on the top right usually. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, there we go.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Sylvia Pap from Hungary. I am a PhD student at the University of Jewish Studies, and I am writing my PhD dissertation on a book related to Buber's philosophy. This is my main interest. And the dialogue between the eternal Thou and man after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. And I read the encounter and interpretation of Job by Buber.
Thank you very much.
That's great.
Well, yeah, so the relation between the human Tao and the eternal Tao is also something that we will have to look into in great detail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much, and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome from Hungary.
Yes. Anna.
Hi. So I have a PhD in communication from University of Montreal. I'm living in Canada right now. My background is in process philosophy, and I'm writing right now a book where I am attempting to develop a theory of communication and qualitative research methodology based on the relational perspective developed by William James and Whitehead. So in my background in process philosophy, my interest in the seminary here is really out of curiosity. I wanted to get out of my comfort zone, and also, well, to know Buber, because I don't know him at all. And just the title, the Martin Buber's Philosophy of Communication, stood out for me. And so it's out of curiosity, really. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to be here.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I started out as a Whiteheadian. I did my doctorate on Whitehead. And I've always felt that has been quite formative in developing this idea of a philosophy of communication as something in its own right. And so for me, there's a deep connection between Whitehead and Buber, although it's hard to spell it out exactly. Charles Hartshorne wrote an article about it a long time ago, in which he also sort of signals this affinity across, of course, many intellectual abysses and distances that exist between them as well. So I'm very happy that you are here to bring that part of into the conversations. Thank you very much. And then Jason.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jason, and I'm a teacher at the University of the Philippines in Cebu City. I teach in the bachelor's program in communication, and I first encountered Martin Buber when I was in graduate school in a course. He was he was lumped together with the existentialist philosophers for that graduate course. And later, when I did my master's in Hamburg, I wrote a thesis on how the thought of Buber, particularly in I and Thou, could be used to transform practices in journalism. And since 2016, I've been integrating the thought of Buber into my classes in the classes I teach about media ethics. I'm really happy to be here. So thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful. You will also have a very important contribution to make. What have you found so far in terms of including a Buber perspective in journalism? Can you say a bit about that? Interests me a lot.
It's rather difficult because journalists are so devoted to beating deadlines, for example, and that really affects any struggle to not objectify sources or people who are represented in news products. So that's one thing, that there's speed, and there's also the idea of autonomy among editors, which in a way is a barrier to presenting a more full portrayal of characters in journalism. Somehow, when editors say want to assert their independence, then that can make it difficult to prevent sources or people portrayed in the media from being objectified. So there are problems there, but also there can be exercises that try to get around that. So that, for instance, if a political representation tends to say caricature someone, then perhaps there might be a need for editors to try to encourage their writers to go for more human interest presentations. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. This will be also an important topic to further explore, and it has to do with the interdisciplinary nature, as Vic already said, not just of Buber but also of us as a group, which is quite evident if we now listen to everyone. Oh, there's one person who's just joined. Ufuk. Did you log in earlier already, or have you just joined?
I just joined, actually.
We were just doing a round of introductions. So
Yeah, hello.
well, welcome to the seminar. Would you like
Yeah.
saying a bit about yourself and why you're interested in the topic?
Yeah, actually, I'm a PhD student in University Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium, and I'm working on intersubjectivity, on in Husserl's phenomenology. So I think that it might be interesting to have different points of view and yeah, maybe to develop this relation with Buber's philosophy and Husserl's phenomenology.
Yeah, exactly. That's a key topic, of course. Did you say that you were in Leuven or in another university? We seem to have lost you. Ufuk, did you say you were in Leuven or in another university?
No, not in Leuven, in Brussels, in Université Libre de Bruxelles.
Ah, okay, yeah, Université Libre.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Sorry.
And welcome to the group. So I was saying, well, we have there's a wonderfully rich group of people that we have together, and that's beautiful, because we're dealing with a very interdisciplinary set of ideas and authors, and we're also dealing with this idea of communication from different perspectives. So there's a philosophical side to it, there is a communication theory side to it, there's a political side to it, there's a theological side to it. And I think Buber was very much aware of the fact that all these things interconnect. And so I think it's very good that there's a literature side to it as well. I think it's very good that we have all those interests represented, and in a way that sort of shows that Buber in that sense still speaks to all of these interests of people from all these different backgrounds come together around him. So thank you very much, and I hope that has given everybody a bit of a sense of who we are, and we will continue that as we go on. As I said, please send me your email addresses if you're happy to be on the email list, and then I will make a list so we can also communicate in that way. So that's the first bit that we wanted to do today. What shall we do next? Vic.
Well, we wanted to, there were two things. One is there was the suggestion that people might just write in like 5 lines in their email to Johan, which would just say something about what they've said today, really, which is just put down their particular interests. So we've got a sense of where people are coming from. And then secondly, we also thought it might be possible at a later stage that people might want to present either some of their own work or some of their own reading. And so we wanted to leave that open as a possibility for the group. So as you can see, this is a kind of journey, and we're trying to kind of find our way through in a way that would meet the needs and desires of everybody who kind of comes along on this journey. But also what we were very well aware of, and this shows, is this is such a new situation where we can talk cross-culturally with people from in very different kind of places and spaces. And I think that's going to demand a certain kind of patience and a certain kind of way of listening to each other across differences. So I think part of a call to a certain kind of precondition for dialogue is a certain way of kind of listening to each other, but also to say something. I wanted to just say something about the times in which we are reflecting. That is how COVID and our experience of COVID is affecting the possibilities of doing intellectual work, and how we think about that intellectual work in a time of COVID. Because the technology has brought us together in a way that we might never have been able to achieve in an earlier time. But it's also brought us together at a particular moment of fear and uncertainty about what the future holds, but also how to make sense of what we've been living through ourselves in the last few months through the experience of COVID. So both the technology, but also the kind of fear as we've lived through it with COVID, has created a different way of thinking about the relationship between distance and relation, which is the paper that we want to give out, which we're distributing for us to think about next time. But we thought it would be useful just to say a little about the current situation in which we are doing this reading and what that reading does in terms of the ideas of distance and relation, particularly in this time of COVID. I'm very acutely aware of it because I'm still coming to terms with the fact that my brother died in this time of COVID. So this seminar is happening also within a period of mourning, a 12-month period of mourning that I'm into, but also how my brother's death and the distance whereby we couldn't go to the hospital or visit. He died in Barnet Hospital on a weekend with two other friends of mine who also died on that same weekend. So I feel kind of both marked by that experience in a kind of way that makes reading Buber, or the context in which I'm reading Buber, quite different. Because the question of distance, of not being able to visit or not to be able to be with, but only able to kind of communicate through texting. So my relationship with Tony just in the last 12 days, it was 12 days between when I first heard the news that he had COVID from when he died, meant that there was a kind of speed up of a process and also a kind of experience of terrible loss, but also not being able to really overcome a certain kind of distance. And that distance was not being able to visit, not being able to really be with in the way that Buber. How do you be with someone who's your brother, who you can't be with physically? How do you undo that distance emotionally and spiritually of a way of being with someone who you can't be with in the same kind of physical way? So it's obliged me to rethink relationships of distance, what it means to be distant or obliged to be distant, and then what it meant to be in relation, because what's been striking also is the way that you can, this is another thing I've been thinking about in preparation for the seminar really. I don't know how many of people in this group have siblings, either brothers or sisters. But it's very interesting, and this morning I spent time thinking about how siblings are both close, you're in relationship with them in the way that Buber talks about it, but you can also be quite distant. So it's a complicated and very helpful to think about relationships with siblings, which at an obvious level are close, but also that can be quite different or distant. I'll give you a kind of example, which has to do with communications. We all, as a family, were very together when my brother was in hospital. But it was through texting that we communicated largely. I had one conversation with him right towards the end. But it was partly through texting. So texting provided a particular form of communication. But my brother's texts were always short. Even in this situation, he would kind of send you a text and it was like 5 or 6 words. And I would send a text, which would probably be like, not a book, but certainly a whole page or two of text. And I'd get a very short kind of response to it. And then when he died, I discovered, and this is just one feature, that my brother, who I had known closely and loved for 70 years over, had been dyslexic. But I never knew that. It's just an example. He'd been dyslexic in a time in the 40s and 50s and 60s where dyslexia was just regarded as a weakness, that you had to deal with it on your own. And that was very much his attitude to it. So that it was a kind of, you deal with things on your own and you compartmentalize your life. So I've been really interested in thinking about what does it mean to compartmentalize and how do you relate to another? What does it mean to be in relationship with someone and you can feel very close to, but at another level you can find out quite important things about someone being dyslexic or someone's sexuality that you only discover much later. So I was thinking, and a lot of my research over time has been around questions of masculinity and gender. So a lot of the things that I've written around masculinity shows particularly how men, particularly forms of masculinity, learn to compartmentalize their lives. We do that, we compartmentalize. But what does it mean when you compartmentalize in terms of questions of distance and relation in Buber's terms? Can you know someone, your sibling, and you know them really well, or feel that you know them really well, but in other ways you don't know them at all, or you know them in certain aspects and not in other aspects? So I've been thinking about the Buber's work and the way in which Buber has or doesn't have a detailed enough understanding of the different ways in which we can communicate or be open to others, or different ways in which we can communicate or be open to ourselves. And that we can be open at some level, like we might be very intellectual and open-minded, but quite closed down emotionally, at an emotional level, that we don't necessarily know ourselves emotionally or have much competence in being able to express or communicate ourselves emotionally. So I've just been thinking a lot about what it means to be in relation, and even the notion of intimacy or closeness, when there are aspects of the self that get compartmentalized and you don't really know or recognize them. And that sometimes, and I'm sure a lot of people all over the world are going through the experience that we as a family are going through. This is in Chile, this is in Hungary, this is in the States. COVID has destroyed some of our aspirations or expectations or anticipations of what the world was going to be like in 2020. And people are dealing with questions of loss, which in the UK are not being named or identified. People are being translated into numbers, to figures, but the actual feelings and experiences of loss are not being communicated. They're not being addressed. I don't know whether this, I know this is pretty similar in Brazil. I don't know what the situation is in, I know how terrible things have been in the States. I've got some idea of other countries. I've been trying to write my way through the COVID experience, the way that I make sense of events is often through trying to write my way through them. But I've been very struck with this, partly because loss or mourning, which is often individual and personal, is in this moment, in this world, at this time, shared across national boundaries and across the world. So when we as a family went through something, a loss with Tony's death, his twin brother, called Teddy, was locked in Rome. He'd been locked down in Rome for already 6 weeks, completely unable to communicate with his twin brother while his twin brother was effectively going through COVID. So the question of distance and relation has come home to me. And that when I read the piece that we're encouraging people to read next week, there's a real awareness of a different practice of reading, and what it means to read or bring ourselves into relationship with a text, where the text is in some way, for Buber, in some way like another person that we're learning to develop a relationship with. And that reading as a practice, encouraged by Buber, isn't simply a matter of making sense, but of what aspects of ourselves do we bring into that reading. It was a wonderful rabbi that Daniel certainly knew and Irit knew, called Sheila Schulman, who also taught at Leobeck College for quite a while. And she talked about the notion of reading whole. That is, she was talking about different practices of reading that Buber had basically encouraged or recognized, where it's a matter of bringing yourself into relationship with the text that you're reading. So it means that, and any student knows this, an undergraduate PhD makes no difference. It isn't the text that changes. You can read Marx when you're 17, and you can read Marx when you're 45, and when you're 75. But what changes is your reading or relationship to the text. And it's the same if you read the Torah, or if you read the Talmud, or any spiritual text. What changes is the relationship between you and how you've changed or your life has changed, and what difference that makes to the reading. So the suggestion is that what does it mean to read in a time of COVID? And what does it mean to meet in the way that we're meeting through technology in a way that means that distance doesn't matter, but we can seem to be more alike than we are, in that we can emerge out of different moments and different cultures and different experiences that we need to be able to share and learn about. But what I was struck with was how I learnt, and I'll finish with this, just how my relationship with my brother is still continuing. It hasn't ended. The dialogue doesn't end with death. Dialogue continues, and relationships change and alter. So we learn things. I learned about my brother's dyslexia, say as an example, and I remembered when we discovered that both my children were dyslexic. And Tony, their uncle, refused to really engage and say, "Oh, I'm dyslexic." What he did was say, "No, there's no such thing." He refused to kind of accept it as a reality. And it was because he had said, or he had learnt in a kind of neoliberal way, this is my life and I've got to deal with it in my way. So it's a very good example of the way that neoliberalism, mentioned by others, also encourages us to compartmentalize, but also that compartmentalizing is something that can also be gendered, and that there are different aspects of our experience that we learn to hold apart. So how do we share ourselves? When do we share ourselves, and in what moment? There's an experience that Buber talks about, which he talks about it a number of times as a very formative experience. And it's the experience, if I just say this for a second, when a student comes to see Buber in his home. And Buber asked him, what is it that you want to talk about? And the student wasn't clear what it was. He didn't know how to formulate what his concern was. And Buber heard him out, but discovered 2 weeks after this encounter that this student had committed suicide. And Buber was shocked at the revelation, shocked to discover this. And he realized that in his listening, what was important was not just listening to what was being said, but listening to what couldn't be said or was struggling to be voiced, but would have called upon him to think or to relate or to be with this person in a different kind of way. So he was suggesting in this moment, which remained important to Buber in the way that he thought about dialogue, that in dialogue, we have to be open to the text that we're reading, but we also have to be very aware of who it is that's reading this text now and in what circumstances, political, economic, and other circumstances in which that reading is actually taking place. So our suggestion that Johan and myself worked out was that we would send out this text on distance and relation, and that we would come together, say, in 2 weeks' time and think about that text. But we might, if we've got any time now, just a bit, speak a bit about how our sense of distance and relation has been shaped by our experience of COVID, and what that experience of COVID has been in the different countries that are reflected or represented here. So my suggestion is that where people wanted to, rather than just going around with everybody, people just tell us about what the impact of COVID has been in the countries that they're living in, but also in people's own sense of the future. How has my sense of the future been changed? And what has that meant about my own possibilities of dialogue?
Thank you very much, Vic, for this very thoughtful reflection. We can also, in a bit, we can put up that short account that Buber gave of this conversation with the student. I have it here. But first, let's.
I don't know if I wanted to say a little bit about what I heard from you, Vic. I don't know if you can hear.
Yeah.
Do you need to see as well? You probably can't see. If you need to see, I'll try and do that. Hello.
Yes, now we can see you.
Hi, Christina.
Yeah. Christina, hi. First of all, Vic, very sorry for your loss. And thank you for speaking of it so openly. It's beyond words, but at the same time, it cannot be. And that it's quandary and it's enigma, I feel. My personal experience of COVID has been marked by my father's death from a totally different cause. He had been ill with cancer for many years, but despite not being touched physically by the virus, the whole environment was affected by it because he died during lockdown, which meant we couldn't be with him in those last moments, and we couldn't really have a moment afterwards that would be properly significant. For myself in particular, I was locked down in London. The whole family is in Italy, so it was months and months before I could even travel there. And the first thing, of course, that we had to face was this huge sense of numbness, this sense of unreality, this very big difficulty in coming to an awareness, a physical awareness of that. So the problems that you touch on, the ways of mourning, that we have to learn and relearn on a collective basis as well, are of huge importance. They are huge issues, as is the function and the ways that we have to rethink our language sometimes. As you say, what does it mean to go through the lines, of a text message? What does it mean to read and speak in these different ways? These are huge, huge issues, and I really am grateful to you for beginning a dialogue on this as well, because these, to learn new ways to keep language helping us to come out of numbness is what we I think are about as language practitioners. So thank you.
No, I think that's really helpful, Christina. I think the experience that we don't have a moral language which is adequate to really understand the experiences that we're going through. And that the moral traditions, which tend to be either Kantian on the one hand or utilitarian on the other, somehow fail us in somehow engaging with the moral situation that we're living through, not only with COVID, with the questions of global warming, with the global emergency, the threats that face us, and that we're trying to find a language and to draw on Buber critically, not to necessarily think, oh, we've just got to understand the text because the truth is somehow there, but to use Buber as a resource in the present moment because he does cross spiritual, political, and intellectual boundaries.
Yes.
He's raring.
Sorry.
And that the notion, what struck me, Christina, when you said it, is the notion of numbness.
Yes.
I mean, to speak out of numbness.
Yes.
Why have so many people talked about being left numb in the face of?
Because we have lost a tradition of mourning through language, a tradition of elegy, a tradition of a tone of voice that isn't either casual or overblown. I was immensely struck when you talked about neoliberalism in connection with your brother's response to the fact of dyslexia, because that's precisely what we are offered by a neoliberalist context. A denial followed by slabs of concrete with lists of names that isn't enough, that doesn't address what people are going through. It sort of cements over what has actually happened. And so our work, I believe, is really to perhaps draw on what Carlo Ginzburg talks about when he speaks of microhistories, to have the courage to say, no individual story is insignificant, no contribution is too small, no way of or no effort, should I say, to keep language close to its emotional roots and intellectual roots, of course, through this double if you like, there's these two strands that we're continually working to weave with is important. None of those efforts, no matter how small, are negligible.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I was very struck, just to go there a bit, that what my brother did was in fact absorb the neoliberal messages that came out with COVID in the early days.
Mm.
He thought it was like what Johnson and what Trump has been saying. It was just like the flu. And he welcomed getting it. He just thought, if I get it, I can get over it. And this was very much the message that was around in late February, early March in Britain. Once a message has been communicated, it's very difficult to dislodge the message. This is one of the really interesting. So you can give people new information, but if they framed their understanding of COVID in a particular kind of way, the new information doesn't necessarily get through. So that's another thing about the limits of communication. If the early messages you get is that if you're strong, this will be nothing, no different from a flu, then even if you know different at one level, at another level, you can live your life as if it reflects no danger. So, and this really challenges, I mean, Buber in this way gives us, or begins to give us, a language to begin to think about how an early message, if taken on, how do you undo it? So people in the congregation will say, if that's how they've learnt it, or if the only other response is complete fear.
Yeah.
People's response to COVID is fear, so that you can't almost move out of your own house or space. And what's the language or alternative language that moral theory or moral philosophy might be able to shape that allows people to engage with their fear, but not to be completely immobilized by it?
There is a question of the relation to language that we have, and how I think, Christina, your point, we lack a certain language, or we lack a way of eulogizing, for example. It seems that language is, and Buber writes about this, is very much consumed by a sort of a technical image, a technical imaginary. Language is information, or language is signification, and a language is an instrument of control. And then when we look at it in that dimension, all these things, Vic, that you mentioned about the message and how message frames later communications, all of that then applies. You might, maybe you could even say, dyslexia is a very healthy relationship. It expresses a very healthy relationship to language, in that it doesn't go along with simplification of language in the administrative view of language in the present circumstance. And there is in Buber an attempt to, right from the start, to get us into a different relation with respect to language. But it's not easy to understand what it is, or to come to experience it. But I think it has everything to do with this thing that the dimension that Vic mentions about how are we whole, and what does that mean?
Yes.
But for Buber, the interesting thing for me is that he points out right from the start that this has to do with verbalization. It has to do with speaking. Not in the sense that we cannot have an ideal relation without spoken words, because we can. It's always within the context of speech that it can happen, even if it then happens in a moment where we don't speak. So what it means for us to exist in speech, I think that is a crucial way of bringing these things together. And that's, for me, that speaks to the contemporary moment where I think we often don't know how we exist in speech, or how to speak from the point of wholeness.
But what do you think it means to speak? What does it mean to exist in relationship to speech if people's response is either numbness or fear? What's the way in which we find a different relationship with language? So rather than think, well, language is just there and it's a question of how we relate to it or how we're positioned through language in a way that a post-structuralist tradition would think about it. How is it that we come to be able to speak differently or voice ourselves differently in relationship to the kind of events that we're living through? So I think there's a way that at least Freud understands or gives some language to the idea of rationalizing. Freud talks about either rationalizing your experience or intellectualizing your experience.
Yeah.
And we've got some grasp of what that means, that someone says quite a lot but doesn't say anything. So there's a way that the notion of intellectualizing our experience, particularly within the academy, so this is a workshop that goes beyond the academy, but within the academy, the ease with which we take defense through intellectualizing our experience,
yeah,
and thinking that language has to be impersonal in order to be objective, and the fear that the personal is the source of bias is very deep within the academy. I spent 30 years, 40 years trying with my first year students to get them to reoccupy the I. Someone was talking about doing a thesis on second person. That people found it increasingly difficult as students after their A-levels in Britain to actually use the I without thinking, if I say I, then I'm being personal,
yeah,
I'm being subjective,
yeah.
and what I say is of little value because it's not objective knowledge. So there's a way that the notion of objectivity is tied to a certain conception of language that has to be framed in the third person, which is also why Buber, when I was an analytical philosophy student, was very difficult to claim, because if you talked personally, it's almost like you were outside the terms of the discussion. So I think there's something about the first person, or how we talk about first person language, that Buber welcomes as a critique of certain notions of intellectual knowledge.
Yes.
That's true. And it's funny how in analytic philosophy, don't go on about analytic philosophy, but how the I is used in a rhetorical sense as a kind of neutralized subject.
Right.
I am going to argue for this, or I'm going to argue for that, or something like that.
That's very interesting.
And there's no one speaking there except the editor of Oxford University Press, who is being channeled through the academics who write the articles, as it were.
So that's a neutralized first person, Johan.
The neutralized first person that is in a way for Buber a little different from an it. You could also say it is going to argue, and that wouldn't make a difference. And so what it means to say I, and this is a question: how do we exist in speech? Yeah, for Buber, that is cannot be abstracted in any way from the ability to say you. And that's also we'll see that next time. That's the conclusion at the end of Distance and Relation. That there is this curious need for the other, for me to be able to become myself without that being a relation or a Hegelian relation, recognition or something like that. It's something very different, and we maybe don't understand yet. But to answer that question, what does it mean to exist in speech? For Buber, that the response to that would have to be be in dialogue. And so we have to then ask ourselves what that dialogue is. And I was struck by what you when you spoke about the need to acknowledge loss and how that happens, or how we can do that in speech and what the language around that is. Is it okay if we just go back very briefly to that example that you mentioned about the visit that Buber had from this student?
Yeah.
Because there you see this point about dealing with loss in a very interesting way from the point of view of Buber, I think, coming back. Yeah? I'm just going to share that with the group. I hope you can read that.
Yeah.
I'll just read a few lines from it, and then we can see how this relates also to the COVID situation, which is a situation of loss, I think, for everyone, not just in terms of people, or not only in terms of close people dying, but also in terms of loss of, for example, loss of youth. Yeah, I think there's if I look at my first year students, there's a loss of what youth is about, and I think that is also a loss. But he talks here first about being religious, and he says this whole discussion of this example occurs in the context of a discussion around what it means to be religious. And he says, in my earlier years, the religious was for me the exception. So it's a special state that is not that of daily life. I won't read it out all. I hope you can see that. It's a bit vague, but so it's a space of illumination and ecstasy and rapture, and that is removed from the time of daily life. And then he says the illegitimacy of such a division of the temporal life, which is streaming to death, and eternity, which only in fulfilling its temporality can be fulfilled in face of these. So there's an interesting point here about being toward death that I think has a lot to do with the ability to speak, that we have to, maybe we can talk about that at some point, was brought home to me by an everyday event, an event of judgment, judging with that sentence from closed lips and unmoved glance, such as the ongoing course of things loves to pronounce. What happened was no more than that one forenoon, after a morning of religious enthusiasm, so he was in this state of ecstasy, I had a visit from an unknown young man without being there in spirit. I certainly did not fail to let the meeting be friendly. I did not treat him any more remissly than all his contemporaries who were in the habit of seeking me out about this time of day as an oracle that is ready to listen to reason. Also very interesting. That's almost as if there's if you're saying, this is Herman Cohen in the background. Religion in the religion of reason out of the sources of Judaism. I conversed attentively and openly with him. Only I omitted to guess the questions which he did not put. Later, not long after, I learned from one of his friends, he himself is no longer alive, the essential content of these questions. I learned that he had come to me not casually, but born by destiny, not for a chat, but for a decision. He had come to me, he had come in this hour. What do we expect when we are in despair and yet go to a man? Surely a presence by means of which we are told that nevertheless there is meaning.
Yeah.
Since then I have given up the religious, which is nothing but the exception, extraction, exaltation, ecstasy, or it has given me up. I possess nothing but the everyday out of which I am never taken. Mystery is no longer disclosed, it has escaped, or it has made its dwelling here where everything happens as it happens. And so what struck me, and as you both were talking, I was reminded of this point here. I omitted to guess the questions which he did not put. And that also the paragraph at the end says that though far from being equal to it, yet I know that in the claim I am claimed, and may respond in responsibility, and know who speaks and demands a response. So it seems to me interesting to say that what was morally, so there is a kind of mourning expressed in the way that this whole thing is written. There is a mourning over what happened, and there is, without sort of guilt tripping, but there is a kind of responsibility that was failed, and this was the failure to respond, quite literally. And what does this failure to respond consist in this example? In a failure, in an omission to guess the questions which he did not put. And I think that's a very interesting word here, to guess, yeah? Which in German would be raten, probably, which has to do with reden and with raad, with counsel. There has to be a kind of going out, almost, of yourself into an unknown, which is the other person that you meet, and where the only way you can go about it is guessing, is putting something forward that might be adequate or correct or relevant or might not be, but in the act of doing that, a relationship can happen. So it seems to me that this is an encounter with, or this word here. Normally we use guessing in a kind of loose way, as a kind of well, if you can't do anything else, then you guess. But here guessing is heightened into an original mode of disclosure or an original mode of relation to the other. And it is hypothetical, it is fallible, it is open, you don't know where it's going, but it is also in a kind of way a proleptic. You run ahead of yourself, and in that way you meet the other. So you go out of yourself, and in that way you meet the other. And this can be something that we can omit. We can not do it. And perhaps in that other relationship to language, that technical relation, that's a language in which we don't guess.
Yeah, perhaps that's precisely the point, that you're in moments of what Buber calls religious enthusiasm. You are projected outside of language, but then you need to have a way in order to live also in the so-called ordinary world to refocus your language. Because if from a point of awareness or consciousness that reaches the unspoken, where it goes beyond where words are, you come into the ordinary reality, then you need a language that is informed by that experience. And I think when he says, I failed to, or I omitted to guess, it's a source of pain for him, precisely to have missed that empathy of language, which sometimes can be forgotten.
Yeah.
But in a sense, those experiences of other senses of religious enthusiasm, as he terms them, they need to sort of be almost threaded, if text is a texture, through the empathy of language. That is a difficult question, for sure.
It is fascinating to reflect that. And those who've read I and Thou, maybe you're reminded of it, and otherwise maybe when you read it you will see it, that Buber talks about stepping into relation there, and he says, in order to do that, I know nothing of the other person, only everything, in his typical way. So I don't need to know any qualities that pertain to somebody as an object in the world or a person in the world in order to have this dialogic relationship.
Though Buber does say in that, in just 3 lines earlier, without being there in spirit. So in that passage, he acknowledges that though he has a mourning of religious enthusiasm, somehow he can't take that spirit into the meeting with the student in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So he is trying to shape a language which includes the notion of spirit, of being there or not being there in spirit, and how do we achieve that? And then thinking in this situation, he wasn't able to do it. I was struck in teaching this passage to kind of young rabbinic students that some of them thought this was too demanding. This was too demanding a requirement, that sometimes, as counselors or as rabbis or as clergy or whatever, I can't be held responsible for intuiting or knowing what someone hasn't said or spoken. So it raised questions for me about questions of responsibility and whether there was a time when you could read this passage but thinking there are issues here in terms of how we understand Buber's meeting or not meeting with that student. And there might well be moments when we might say, well, Buber couldn't be expected to know what was happening given how closed down the student might have been. Rather than, so I think there are difficult questions about the relationship of dialogue and responsibility, that responsibility in contrast to the Levinas, really, that it's not that it's reciprocal, but the balance of responsibilities has to be thought about quite carefully before we come to judgment, Or we might think, well, Buber's being too hard on himself, thinking that he could have or should have somehow been able to respond to the student. Unless we know more, we might need to know more, we might need to question Buber more to say something about, well, what was said or not said, and what did it mean not being there in spirit. Not being there in spirit might mean not being open to connection.
Yeah, exactly. He closes himself off from the connection.
And he recognizes that.
And he recognizes that, but that may be something that you can be excused for, or maybe not, but that's a different question.
Yeah.
He then proceeds to give a precise answer to the sort of the question, well, how would that have been avoided if he hadn't done that? And that is by guessing.
I think Vic, your rabbinic students raise a very good point, though, and for me it sort of circles back to something you said as you introduced this discussion with the story about your brother, because you were sort of thinking about the things that you couldn't or didn't know about your brother despite having known him so well, right? In many other respects, and it just struck me, as you said that, it struck me that it's not just that we don't know our brothers, our sisters, our parents, our children so well, but we don't know ourselves so well. Right? There are depths of the self that are hard to excavate, maybe impossible. And so it's not clear to me how we could really expect to achieve the kind of intimate encounter that Buber seems to chide himself for not having had there with others when we can hardly even have it with ourselves.
Yeah,
no, I think that's right. I think that's a really important thing to recognize, that it isn't either or at some level, that we might know someone really well in some ways, as I knew my brother really well. I knew I could rely on him. I knew that through my mother's dementia that we brought different skills or capacities into that relationship, and we were 100% there for each other. But we also knew that we were quite different, always. So it's a question of how do we acknowledge both the differences with our siblings, so that you can be both in relationship to, at some level, very close, intimate, and at another level, not other aspects, not knowing what they are. And I think that Buber gives you a good starting point, but we might need, and I've been reflecting on this, to think of more extensive moral vocabulary in which you can begin to think, well, I am open at some levels, but not open in others. I might be very open intellectually and very closed emotionally. It's what John Stuart Mill famously talks about it in his autobiography. He talks about, and you would know this as the politics department, he talks about how he, in his early years with his father, developed enormously intellectually, but he remained a child emotionally. He was never given a chance and didn't know how to develop. And it wasn't till his relationship with Harriet Taylor, which was a close relationship, that he began to know himself emotionally in some way. So it might be, and Buber doesn't necessarily give you a moral psychology, a sufficient moral, and we will talk about this next time, but of the different levels of experience that we might be able to recognize. So with my brother, I think, no, I knew him very well in some ways, and in other ways, he didn't want me to know. He blocked my knowing. He didn't want me to know. He wanted to feel, and this goes back to family history, he wanted to feel this was his life and he had control over it. And he wanted exactly to know what he would share with others and what he wouldn't share. So the idea, and it goes back in political theory to the notion of Locke, basically, the idea that I am the owner of my person, very deep in liberal political theory. I'm the owner, I own my body, I own myself, you know? And therefore, I am my own possession, and it's up to me what to share or what not to share with anybody, you know? And that claim to ownership is very deep in liberal political theory. I wrote a text called Kant, Respect and Injustice, which you can all Google or whatever. But in that, it was questioning the notion that my relationship to myself is one of ownership. If we question that, where does that leave us? You know, it's what Christina was partly opening up. What if it isn't ownership? What is it? How do we think about our relationship to ourselves? And it might not be, in the way that you suggested, Peter, that we don't know ourselves. It might not be a question of knowledge. And Buber suggests it might be not just a matter of the knowledge or the way that we know ourselves.
That's right. It's a point of relationality, and
yes,
so
and a relationship to different parts of ourselves. How do we begin to shape a moral language that has an aspect of different parts to ourselves? The person that I'm reading on the moment in Australia is Iris Murdoch, who was influenced by Buber and actually wrote about Buber in some way. But Iris Murdoch is interesting also in challenging the moral language that we have within liberal moral cultures, and suggesting there's a wonderful collection of her essays which is called Existentialists and Mystics. It's a beautiful collection of essays. It's a Penguin paperback. But in that, she has a critique of various traditions of philosophy, both analytical philosophy, but also existentialism. She has a wide reading in her work, in which she recognizes the need for a different kind of moral language in which we can begin to frame how we know and yet don't know, how we know ourselves in some ways, but we're constantly surprised by what we might say. You know, we don't know what we're going to say. And that was the joy of meeting with Johan, that we knew if we did this, we weren't going to set out a course that we knew. We wanted to create a learning community in which there was sufficient trust for us to experiment or say things which were foolish or we didn't know. Exactly. You know, that we didn't have the answers, that we kind of were just going to try things out. And hopefully we would gather, as we have, this is a wonderful group, beyond all our expectations, a group of people in which we can share and explore things that we're just trying to find a way of shaping.
Exactly. Underscoring the point that in order to have dialogue, you don't need to know the other person in a objective way. Okay, so yeah, I think it's 6 o'clock here, so it's time for us to draw the session to a close today. Is there, and can I give the final word to anyone who would like to say something? If not at this point, then
Does anybody want to say goodbye?
Yes,
we'll say goodbye in a minute. We'll say goodbye in a minute, but not before reminding everyone to, if you haven't got that distance and relation text yet, you can go to the website, and under the next session there's a link where you can download it. If you have a problem with that, please let me know. Thank you to everyone. It was a wonderful session. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to the journey that lies ahead for all of us.
Thank you.
Don't forget, some of you have already given me your email address in the chat, but if you haven't done that, please send me an email at johan.siebers@sas.ac.uk, which is also on the module website, so I can set up that email list. And I'm looking forward very much to seeing you next time.